Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched in the comments. The sun sat heavy over the Arizona desert, bleaching the rocks and drying the creek into a thread of shallow water. Boone Ward moved along the bank, boots crunching against flint and cracked roots. He was a man who spoke little, carried what he owned on his horse, and trusted almost no one. Years spent tracking herds and guarding freight lines had carved the lines of his face. He was heading north, alone, toward a small mining camp near Silver Creek where work, any kind, paid in cash or cartridges. That was his mission: survive another month, keep moving, never stay long enough to care. He stopped when he saw her. A woman lay half in the water, one leg twisted awkwardly, her breathing shallow. Her dark hair was plastered against her cheek. The color of her skin and the pattern of the beadwork on her torn buckskin dress told him she was Apache. Boone's first thought was that it could be a trap. He'd seen wounded decoys before. His second thought was that she looked too weak to move, let alone lure him. He scanned the brush line. Nothing but heat haze and circling flies. When she lifted her head slightly, her voice cracked. "Snake, it bit me." Boone hesitated, jaw tight, eyes narrowing on her calf. His instincts pulled in two directions: walk away or kneel. He stood motionless for several seconds, weighing risk against decency. Finally, he stepped forward, slowly lowering his rifle to the dirt. "Where?" he asked. She pointed weakly to a patch of red just above her ankle. The skin wasn't swollen, but Boone couldn't tell from a distance. He dropped to one knee, unhooked his knife, and sliced through the edge of her legging. Her breath caught sharply. He didn't look at her face, just the wound. 2 marks, faint, uneven. Could have been from a thorn. Could have been a lie. But he'd come this far. He pressed his thumb near it. No swelling. No spreading color. Still, he bent closer, closed his mouth around the spot, and drew hard. The taste of dirt and skin hit him. He spat into the creek, did it again. She trembled. Not from pain, but from something else she didn't understand herself. The warmth of his breath, the steadiness in his movements. She hadn't been touched without harm in a long time. Boone worked in silence until he was sure nothing venomous was there. When he finally looked at her face, her eyes didn't hold fear, only exhaustion and a trace of guilt. She thanked him in a low voice. He nodded once, stood, and fetched his canteen. "Drink," he said simply. She obeyed, her hands shaking. He noticed how thin she was, how her boots were worn smooth, how she kept glancing down the creek like someone expecting pursuit. He didn't ask questions. His rule was simple: don't pry, don't promise. Still, something in her face, half defiance, half broken trust, kept him there. He gathered dry wood and struck a small fire under cottonwood. As the flames caught, he wrapped his coat around her shoulders and sat a few feet away. He didn't want to talk, but the silence pressed heavy. "My name is Ayoka," she said finally. Boone stared at the fire, then nodded. "Boone," he replied after a moment. No more words followed. The creek hummed softly beside them. Boone kept his eyes on the darkness beyond the trees, his rifle within reach. Ayoka watched him with a mix of gratitude and suspicion. She'd lied to him. There was no snake. The wound came from a jagged branch she'd fallen on while fleeing her own tribe. They had driven her out after she defied a forced marriage arranged by her uncle. The lie was instinct. The truth was too complicated to explain to a stranger with a gun. Boone sat rigid, aware of how fragile this moment was. A lone woman in Apache garb, a white cowboy with a rifle. If anyone rode by, there'd be questions neither could afford to answer. His pulse stayed steady, but inside, he was measuring every sound. The wind in the reeds, a coyote yipping far off, the crackle of sap in the fire. He hadn't meant to stop that day. He hadn't meant to care. But something about the look in her eyes when he cut open her legging, half shame, half relief, had anchored him in place. When the sun sank, he passed her a piece of dried meat and refilled her water. She accepted both with quiet hands. Boone stretched his blanket out between them, close enough to share the warmth of the fire, far enough not to threaten her. He lay down, facing the dark, his mind replaying the image of her lying by the creek, that first flicker of fear, that whisper about a snake. She turned on her side, watching his back. The night air cooled, bringing the smell of mesquite smoke and wet stone. Neither of them slept easily. Boone kept waking to check the shadows. Ayoka kept staring at the faint glow of the fire, thinking of the lie that had tied them together, one she could never take back. When dawn finally broke, the air was still and the world pale. Boone rose first, poured water over the coals, and packed his gear. He glanced once toward her leg, the skin already healing clean. He didn't ask questions. He just said, "You can walk." She nodded. He handed her a strip of cloth to wrap it again. "Stay close to the creek," he advised. "Water runs north." "So do I." That was all it took. Without planning it, they started walking the same direction. Two strangers, one truth withheld, one kindness unspoken, moving together because walking alone had stopped working long ago. Morning light spread slowly through the cottonwoods, soft and pale, touching the creek with a thin silver line. Boone stood knee-deep in the shallows, washing the dust from his hands. Behind him, Ayoka sat on a flat rock, adjusting the strip of cloth around her leg. Her face looked different in daylight, less frightened, more guarded. The lies still sat between them, though he didn't know it. She felt it every time his eyes met hers and looked away again. Boone checked the horizon. No movement, no riders. The trail ahead curved north through open country, rocky ridges, dry mesquite, long miles of heat. He didn't plan on company, but she had no horse, and he couldn't leave her there. He wasn't proud of what that said about him, only that it was true. "You can walk?" he asked again, more to be sure than to make conversation. "I can," she said quietly. He gave a short nod, tightened his saddle straps, and offered his canteen. "We'll follow the creek. There's a trail joins the main road after 2 miles." They moved together in silence. The morning air was cool, but the promise of heat hung close. Ayoka limped slightly at first, then steadied her pace, refusing help. Boone noticed, but didn't mention it. He wasn't a man who offered comfort easily. After an hour, she broke the silence. "Why are you alone out here?" He took a moment before answering. "Work's easier that way. No one slows you down." "What kind of work?" He hesitated. "Whatever pays. Ranch hands, freight guard, sometimes trail scout. I head north to Silver Creek. Heard they're hiring men who can shoot straight and keep quiet." She studied him as they walked. "You fought in the wars." He didn't look at her. "I was there. Doesn't matter where." His tone made clear the subject was closed. Ayoka dropped it, though the question lingered in her mind. Something about the way he spoke, measured, tired, careful, told her he'd seen more killing than he wanted to remember. By midday, the land flattened into a long stretch of sun and grit. The creek thinned to a trickle. Boone stopped at a stand of mesquite and dropped his pack. "Rest here. We'll eat before the next ridge." He pulled jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag, boiled creek water in a dented tin cup, and poured half to cool for her. She took it with both hands, drinking slow. Boone sat opposite, hat brim low, eyes scanning the horizon. "Where you going?" he asked finally, voice even. Ayoka hesitated. "East," she said. "There's a settlement near the hills. White traders sometimes take in workers. Maybe I can earn food, sewing, or mending." Boone didn't press further, but the way she avoided his gaze told him she was hiding more than just direction. "You got people looking for you?" Her throat tightened. "No, not anymore." He nodded once, accepting it as fact even though it wasn't the full truth. That was enough for now. When the sun dropped lower, they started walking again. Dust clung to their boots, and heat shimmered off the stones. At times, Boone would ride ahead on his horse to scout the next stretch, then return to walk beside her. He didn't talk much, but he watched the ridges, checked the wind, and marked each print they left behind. Ayoka noticed how his eyes moved, always scanning, never resting. She realized he was the kind of man who never truly relaxed, even when he appeared still. His silence wasn't coldness, it was discipline. She began to understand why he survived this long. When dusk came, they reached a broken windmill by an old freight route. The tank beside it was dry, but the frame offered shelter. Boone tethered his horse, gathered wood, and built a small fire. Ayoka folded her blanket, sitting close enough to feel the heat. She looked at him across the flames. "Why help me?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He rolled a cigarette, lit it, and stared into the fire. Didn't think about it much. "You were breathing, that's all. That's reason enough." His tone wasn't soft, but something in it steadied her. She turned her eyes back to the fire, remembering her tribe's law, that a woman cast out carried shame wherever she went. Here, with this stranger, the shame felt quieter. As night deepened, Boone spoke again, voice low. "This country's rough. You keep near me till you find your place. After that, you go your way, I go mine." She nodded. "All right." Neither said good night. Boone laid out his blanket with his rifle beside it. Ayoka turned away, pretending to sleep, though her eyes stayed open for a long time. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of small questions they didn't dare ask. Who she was before, what he'd done to carry that weight in his eyes, what either of them would become if they stopped running. By morning, the trail would take them deeper into open land, toward the burned-out town of Ash Creek. But that night, under the faint hum of windmill blades turning slow in the dark, both knew they'd already crossed an invisible line between chance and trust, though neither spoke the word for it. The sun came up hard the next morning, bright, sharp, and without mercy. Dust drifted across the trail like smoke as Boone and Ayoka moved north. He led his horse by the reins, walking beside her, the rhythm of their steps quiet but steady. The land around them was raw, burned mesquite, scorched fence posts, empty ground where cattle once grazed. In the distance, a faint plume of gray marked what was left of a town. Boone had seen that kind of smoke before. It meant trouble had passed through recently, raiders, drought, or worse. Still, they needed supplies, coffee, salt, ammunition. He also wanted to check if any wanted posters carried his name from an old job gone bad years ago, the kind he never mentioned but couldn't fully forget. Ayoka didn't ask where they were headed. She followed quietly, her limp nearly gone. Her silence wasn't fear anymore, it was caution. When the town came into view, it looked half dead. Wooden fronts were blackened from fire, roofs sagging under sun damage. A few buildings stood untouched, a trading post, a saloon with no music, and a church with one side of its bell tower missing. Boone's eyes swept the street. No lawman, no crowd, just a handful of tired souls moving slow, watching strangers too long. They stopped outside the general store. A sign hanging crooked above the door read, "G. Malden and Damp. Sons." Boone tied his horse to the rail and checked the street again before speaking. "Stay close," he told Ayoka. "Don't talk unless you have to." Inside, the air was thick with dust and kerosene. Shelves leaned under the weight of canned beans and old tools. The storekeeper, a man with gray stubble and a sharp look, studied them from behind the counter. His gaze lingered on Ayoka longer than Boone liked. Boone's hand rested near his belt buckle, not touching the pistol, but close enough to remind the man that he wasn't alone in here. "What you need?" the storekeeper asked. "Coffee, flour, a box of .44 cartridges if you've got M," Boone said flatly. The man turned, grabbed the items, and dropped them on the counter. His eyes flicked again to Ayoka. "Ain't seen her kind around since the fort closed. You two traveling through?" Boone didn't answer. He laid coins on the counter and looked the man square in the eyes until the question died where it started. Ayoka stayed silent, hands folded tight in front of her. When they stepped back out into the street, Boone noticed two riders leaning near the water trough, pretending to check their horses but watching too long. Their coats were dark, their saddles worn. The kind of men who worked odd jobs, some legal, most not. "Keep walking," Boone said under his breath. "Don't turn." Ayoka did as told. Her heartbeat picked up. She could feel the men's eyes on her back. Boone guided her toward the edge of town, one hand resting casually near his holster. They reached the last building, a collapsed barn, before the riders called out. "Hey, cowboy, ain't safe traveling with that kind of company," one of them said, voice mocking. Boone stopped but didn't turn. "Ain't your concern," he answered calmly. "Maybe it is," the man replied. "Heard there's a bounty for anyone bringing in Apache runaways. Pays good." Ayoka froze. Boone stepped slightly in front of her, his stance shifting, one foot angled, one hand low. "You heard wrong," he said. The silence that followed was tight as a pulled trigger. Then, one of the men spat into the dirt and muttered something under his breath. Boone's eyes met his. Whatever he saw there made the man look away first. After a tense beat, the riders mounted up and turned down another street. When they were gone, Boone let out a slow breath. Let's move. They left Ashtown before sunset, following a back trail lined with sagebrush and rusted fencing. The wind carried the smell of smoke and iron. Ayoko walked a few steps behind, trying to steady her nerves. She hadn't told him that her tribe's hunters were still after her, that her uncle had sworn to bring her back alive or dead. That kind of truth only brought more danger. But she could tell Boone suspected something. His silence had changed. It wasn't distance anymore. It was awareness. As dusk settled, they reached a low ridge where the land opened wide. From there, the valley stretched for miles, flat, endless, empty. Boone stopped to rest his horse and looked back toward the fading town lights. You tell me the truth, he said finally, without turning. Those men knew something. You running from someone? Ayoka stared at the ground. Yes, she said softly, but not for the reason they think. He looked at her, eyes steady but not unkind. You stole something? Killed someone? No, I refused someone, she answered. My tribe wanted me to marry a man I hated. I left. That's all. Boone studied her face in the dim light. No trembling, no lies this time. Just a tired woman trying to outwalk her past. That'll be enough for me, he said. But next time, you tell me first. I will, she promised. They made camp that night near a dry riverbed. Boone built a low fire, shielding the light with a blanket of brush. Ayoka watched him work, noticing how precise he was, never wasted movement, never left tools lying. His calm steadiness made her feel safe in a way she hadn't in years. When the fire settled into embers, she spoke quietly. You saved me twice now. Boone looked at her across the flickering light. Don't count it yet, he said. We've still got miles to go. The night deepened. Coyotes howled far off. Boone sat awake long after Ayoka slept, his rifle across his knees. He wasn't sure what kept him there, duty, decency, or something he didn't want to name. But for the first time in years, he felt the faint pull of purpose. As the fire dimmed to red coals, he looked toward her sleeping shape and thought, this life she carries, whatever it is, I'll learn it in time. Then he turned his eyes back to the dark ridge and waited for morning. The storm came with no warning. Wind first, then rain that smelled of dust and iron. Boone saw the dark line rolling across the sky long before it hit, a wall of thunder swallowing the horizon. He pushed the horse faster, eyes scanning for shelter, his hat brim dripping. Beside him, Ayoka fought to keep pace, her blanket clutched tight around her shoulders. The air turned cold and sharp, the kind that stripped warmth straight out of the skin. Up there, Boone said, pointing toward a rise of rock ahead. Through the sheets of rain, a small cabin appeared. Half-rotten walls, a slanted roof, one shutter hanging loose. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. They reached it just as the downpour broke wide. Inside, the place smelled of damp wood and mouse droppings. A stone hearth sat cold in the corner. Boone dropped his pack, struck a match, and fed kindling until the fire caught. Orange light filled the small space, bouncing off rough log walls. Water dripped from their clothes onto the dirt floor. Ayoka stood near the fire, shivering, her hair heavy and dark with rain. Boone kept his distance, pulling his coat off and hanging it on a peg. You can use the blanket to dry off, he said quietly. She nodded, voice soft. Thank you. For a long moment, neither spoke. The storm hammered the roof, wind whistling through cracks in the boards. Boone busied himself unpacking, coffee tin, frying pan, a small sack of beans. He moved with the slow precision of habit. She watched him, noticing how everything he did was deliberate, like a man who'd lived too long without trust and learned to rely only on his own order. When the fire burned steady, he crouched and poured beans into the pan, adding water from the canteen. You can rest, he said. We'll ride when it clears. Ayoka sank onto the edge of the bunk, still rubbing her hands for warmth. You always travel alone? She asked. Boone glanced at her. Mostly. Why? He stirred the pan with a stick, thinking before he answered. People bring trouble. Talk too much. Ask questions you can't afford to answer. She gave a faint smile. And me? I bring trouble too. Maybe, he said, but you're quiet. She looked into the fire, the light catching the red in her eyes. You think quiet means safe? No, he replied. Just easier to live with. The rain kept falling, drumming steady on the roof. The smell of coffee and smoke filled the air. For the first time since the creek, Boone let his guard slip just enough to sit down beside her. They ate in silence, beans, dry bread, and hot coffee shared between two tin cups. Afterward, Ayoka took out a small leather pouch from her belt, unwrapped a thin needle and thread. Her leggings were still torn where Boone had cut them. She began sewing them slowly, hand steady now. Boone watched her work, his gaze quiet but attentive. What did you do before all this? He asked. I made clothes for the women in my band, she said. My mother taught me. She said a strong stitch keeps you remembered. Boone nodded. She's still alive? Ayoka's voice thinned. No, they buried her last winter. The words hung heavy between them. Boone didn't offer sympathy. He wasn't good at it, but his eyes softened slightly before he looked away. When the storm eased to a drizzle, Boone rose and checked the door latch. The sound of rain lessened, leaving only the low hiss of the fire. He set his rifle near the entrance and returned to the chair beside the hearth. Ayoka stretched out on the bunk, her body relaxing for the first time in days. After a long silence, she said quietly, When I left my people, I thought I would die alone. But the night you found me, I was not ready. Boone stared at the fire. No one ever is. You saved me, she said. He shook his head slightly. You were breathing. I just kept it that way. A faint smile crossed her face before her eyes drifted shut. Boone stayed awake, listening to the fire pop, the wind outside, shifting directions. His mind kept replaying her words. I thought I would die alone. Something about it hit deeper than he wanted to admit. He had thought the same thing once, back in Kansas after the war, when everyone he trusted was buried under hard dirt. He'd stopped believing in people after that. Yet here he was again, watching over someone because leaving her felt wrong. Just before dawn, the storm broke completely. Moonlight came through the cracks in the shutter, silver and soft. Ayoka stirred in her sleep, murmuring something in Apache, a prayer, maybe, or a name. Boone didn't understand the words, but the tone was tender, almost peaceful. He stepped outside into the wet air. The land glistened under the moon, the creek below swollen but calm. He stood there a long time, the sound of frogs and dripping leaves filling the quiet. For the first time in years, he felt a small sense of direction, not just north or west, but towards something he couldn't name yet. When he returned inside, the fire had burned low. Ayoka was still asleep, her breathing slow and even. Boone settled at the door, rifle across his knees, eyes on the dark beyond the window. The storm had passed, but both of them knew the road ahead would not stay quiet for long. He looked at her one last time before dawn and whispered under his breath, We keep moving at first light. By dawn, the storm had thinned to a gray mist that clung to the grass and tree bark. Boone saddled the horse in silence, shaking the rain from the blanket before throwing it over the animal's back. Ayoka helped gather their gear without being asked, folding the damp blanket she had slept under and tying it tight with a strip of rawhide. The fire had died to cold ash, and the air smelled clean again. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. The rhythm of travel had settled between them like an unspoken agreement. When they set out, the ground was soft underfoot. The trail cut through rolling flats scattered with mesquite and dried thistle. The air was heavy with moisture, the sky pale and low. Boone rode ahead for a stretch, scanning the horizon, checking for smoke or riders. His instincts rarely rested. He'd learned long ago that safety in the desert was a temporary condition. By midday, the sun pushed through the clouds. Steam rose off the ground, carrying the scent of wet earth. They stopped by a dry wash where a shallow pool still held rainwater. Boone let his horse drink, then crouched to fill their canteen. Ayoka sat on a rock nearby, her face lifted to the sunlight. For the first time in days, color returned to her cheeks. He noticed her watching the sky, calm and distant. You look like you belong here, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "This land knows my blood," she replied, "but it forgot my name." Boone didn't know how to answer that, so he didn't. He just capped the canteen and handed it to her. She took it, their hands brushing briefly, small, unintentional, but enough to make both aware of it. They ate dried beef and cornbread, sharing in silence. Boone's thoughts wandered while they rested. He'd been trying to figure her out since the creek. How someone could lie so easily yet look at him with eyes that carried no deceit. Part of him still wondered if she was running from more than a forced marriage. But the truth, he realized, no longer mattered as much as the fact that she stayed. Around mid-afternoon, Boone's head lifted suddenly. The stillness had changed. The desert had a sound when danger moved through it. Birds went silent, wind stilled. His eyes swept the ridge above the wash. A thin flicker of motion caught the light. "Riders," he said. Ayoka's breath quickened. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Don't look up." He tightened the cinch on his saddle and motioned for her to move toward the rock outcrop. They crouched low as the first man appeared on the ridge, broad shoulders, dark vest, rifle laid across his saddle horn. Behind him, 2 others followed, faces shadowed by their hats. "Same men from Ashtown," Boone muttered. "I knew they'd circle back. What do they want?" "Her, most likely," Boone thought but didn't say. Aloud he answered, "Trouble. Always the same kind." The riders dismounted halfway down the slope, scanning the wash. Boone's hand slid to his revolver, thumb resting on the hammer. "When I tell you, move behind that tree line," he whispered. Ayoka nodded, eyes fixed on him. She was afraid, but she didn't freeze. He could see that her breathing was fast but steady, her grip on the walking stick tight. She wasn't helpless, not anymore. The first shot came without warning, a crack that sent dust flying from the rock near Boone's shoulder. He returned fire instantly, hitting the slope just above the nearest rider, forcing him to duck. "Go!" Boone shouted. Ayoka sprinted across the wash, sliding behind a fallen log. She glanced back once, just long enough to see Boone fire again, his movements controlled and efficient. He wasn't panicked. He was working, steady, focused, every shot measured. One of the riders circled wide, trying to flank him. Ayoka, crouched low, spotted the move and grabbed a handful of sand. When a man came near, she threw it full in his face, then swung the stick hard against his wrist. He cursed, the gun flying from his hand. Boone turned at the sound and fired once more, the bullet kicking up dirt inches from the man's boot. That was enough. The rider staggered back, clutching his wrist, and the others, seeing the ambush had failed, mounted and retreated in a storm of dust and curses. When the noise died, only the wind returned. Boone lowered his revolver, chest rising slow. "You all right?" he called out. "Yes," she answered, breathless but steady. He crossed to her, checking for wounds. There were none, only a scrape on her arm. His own shirt, though, was dark near the shoulder, a bullet crease bleeding slowly. "Let me see," she said. "It's nothing," he muttered, but when she reached for him, he didn't pull away. She tore a strip from her sleeve, pressed it against the wound, and tied it tight. Her hands trembled. Boone could feel the heat of her palms even through the blood. "You shouldn't have helped," he said. "You would have been shot," she replied. "I owed you." He met her eyes then, really met them, and something in his expression softened. "You don't owe me anything, Ayoka. You walk beside me. That's enough." They stayed there until the sun dipped behind a ridge. The sand was streaked with old blood and boot prints. Boone gathered what they could carry, knowing they had to move before dark. The gunfire would draw attention. By nightfall, they reached higher ground, a narrow canyon with a clear view of the valley below. Boone built a small fire behind a rock wall to hide the light. Ayoka washed the dried blood from his shoulder with water from the canteen. He didn't flinch, though the sting was sharp. "Why do they follow us?" she asked quietly. "Men like that don't need reasons," he said. "But if they saw you in town, they might think there's a price on you." "There isn't," she said quickly, but the look in her eyes betrayed uncertainty. Boone didn't press her. Not tonight. He watched the firelight flicker across her face. She was different now from the woman he'd found by the creek, stronger, alert, less afraid of his silence. She'd stopped being someone to protect and started being someone to stand beside. "You handled yourself well today," he said. She gave a small, tired smile. "I learned from watching you." Boone grunted softly, amused despite himself. "Don't learn too much. My way gets men killed." Later, when the night turned colder, Ayoka dozed near the fire while Boone kept watch, his back against the rock. He thought about the riders, the way they'd tracked them from Ashtown. It meant word was spreading about a cowboy and an Apache woman traveling together. That kind of story carried risk. The frontier didn't forgive mixed company. He looked at her sleeping beside the fire, her face calm in the flickering light, and made his decision. Tomorrow they'd reach Silver Creek, civilization of a sort. He could find work there, maybe buy her safe passage east. He told himself it was practical. He didn't admit that the idea of parting ways left an emptiness he hadn't expected. When dawn came, Boone rose before her and saddled the horse. The wound in his shoulder throbbed, but he ignored it. Ayoka stirred, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Where to now?" she asked. "Silver Creek," he said. "It's time we stopped running and found out who's really following us." She nodded. There was fear in her face, but trust, too, the kind that doesn't need words. They started walking side by side, the trail stretching ahead through sun and dust, the first faint smoke of the next town rising far off on the horizon. By the time Boone and Ayoka reached the outskirts of Silver Creek, the sun had already slipped behind the western hills, leaving a dull orange glow across the horizon. The town stretched low and tired across the plain, planked buildings, a narrow main street, and the faint hum of a piano from a saloon at the far end. It wasn't much, but after weeks of open country, even the faint smell of smoke and cooked food felt almost civilized. Boone slowed his horse, scanning the street as they entered. He'd been here once, years back, when the place was smaller and meaner. Now it looked like it had learned how to pretend a decency. Ayoka walked beside the horse, her shawl pulled up to hide her face. Boone could feel the eyes of the townsfolk as they passed. Miners, storekeepers, drifters, curious stares that said everything without a word. An Apache woman traveling with a white man was the kind of thing people noticed, and not kindly. He didn't like it, but he'd expected it. They stopped near the doctor's office, a weathered sign swinging on two chains. Boone dismounted carefully, his shoulders stiff from the bullet graze. Ayoka noticed the way he held his arm and stepped closer. "You should see him," she said softly. "You're bleeding again." "I've had worse," he muttered, though his face was pale. She looked at him, steady and unblinking. "You helped me when I didn't ask. Now you let me help you." He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. "All right." Inside, the office smelled of whiskey and antiseptic. The doctor, an older man with round glasses and a slow drawl, looked up from his desk. "What happened here?" "Bullet crease," Boone said. "Need it cleaned and stitched." The doctor frowned, but waved him toward the cot. "You're lucky. An inch lower and you'd be bones by now. Sit still." Ayoka stood nearby, watching silently as the doctor cleaned the wound with carbolic. Boone didn't make a sound, though his jaw tightened. The doctor glanced at Ayoka, then back at Boone. "You folks passing through?" Boone's voice was even. "Looking for work. Might stay if it's quiet." The doctor gave a small grunt. "Quiet's not what this place does best, son. The mine up north's been stirring trouble. Men get drunk, shoot each other, disappear. Marshals stretched thin." When the stitching was done, Ayoka handed over a few silver beads from her pouch to pay. The doctor started to refuse, but she placed them firmly on his table. "For your work," she said. He nodded, impressed despite himself. "You two take care," he muttered, eyes softening. Outside, the night air was cool. Boone flexed his shoulder, testing it. "That'll do," he said. "We'll find a place to sleep." They walked to the edge of town and found a small boarding house run by an older widow who asked few questions. Boone paid for a single room, 2 beds clean enough. The woman looked from him to Ayoka, hesitated, then took the money and handed him the key. "You keep your heads down," she warned. Inside the room, the lamplight was warm and dim. Ayoka sat on the edge of the bed, her body still tense from the day's ride. Boone set his hat on the table, sat down across from her, and started checking his revolver. "You shouldn't show your face too much around town," he said. There's talk about bounties on runaways. I heard it before back in Ashtown. We don't need that kind of attention. I'm not running anymore, she said quietly. I told you the truth. There's no crime behind me. I believe you, he said, meeting her eyes. But that doesn't mean they will. Her gaze dropped to the floor. Then what do we do? We stay quiet. I'll find work in the morning. You stay here till I know the town's safe. She nodded but didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. You've done enough for me. You don't have to keep going. Boone leaned back, exhaling through his nose. Maybe not, but we're both better off together than apart. That's enough reason. He said it like a fact, not kindness, but it landed heavier than he meant it to. For the first time, Ayoka smiled faintly, tired but genuine. The next morning, Boone found work guarding freight wagons that ran north toward the mines. The pay was thin but steady. Each day he left before sunrise, returned after dark, his clothes covered in dust and sweat. Ayoka spent the days helping the widow, mending linens, cooking simple meals. She drew no attention, kept her head down. The town's gossip swirled around them but never quite touched them. Weeks passed that way. Routine settled in, a fragile kind of peace. Boone's shoulder healed. The town learned to look past the woman in the shawl. Yet the air between them changed, heavier with things left unsaid. One evening, as Boone cleaned his rifle at the table, Ayoka set down 2 tin cups of coffee and said quietly, "You should know something." He looked up. "Go on." "There was no snake," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but it was careful, almost resigned. "That day at the creek," I lied. "I was hurt, yes, but not by a bite. I needed your help, and I didn't know how else to ask." Boone stared at her, expression unreadable. The fire crackled behind them. After a long silence, he said, "You think I didn't already know?" Ayoka blinked, surprised. "You knew. I figured out a while back," he said simply. "Didn't matter. You were scared. Everyone lies when they're scared." She didn't know what to say to that. The truth she'd carried for so long, the shame, the guilt, suddenly felt smaller, almost foolish. She looked down at her hands. "I didn't mean to trick you." Boone set his rifle aside. "You didn't. You just stayed alive. That's more than most can say." The words hit her harder than she expected. She felt a weight lift, quiet, subtle, but real. A knock came at the door before either could speak again. Boone rose, hand instinctively going to his revolver. He opened the door just enough to see the boarding house widow standing there, eyes wide. "Boone," she whispered, "there's 3 men downstairs asking about an Apache woman. Said she travels with a cowboy named Ward." Boone's voice hardened. "Did you tell them anything?" "I said I don't know you," she answered. "But they're not leaving." Boone nodded once. "Thank you." He closed the door and turned to Ayoka. "Pack your things." She froze. Who are they? Could be the same ones from Ashtown. Could be worse. Either way, we're not staying to find out. He moved quickly, checking his ammunition, slinging the saddlebag over his shoulder. Ayoka gathered her few belongings, wrapping her shawl tight. Boone blew out the lamp, opened the window, and looked down into the narrow alley behind the building. "We'll go out this way," he said. Quiet. They slipped into the night, the street behind them humming with voices and the creak of wagon wheels. Boone led the way through the shadows, his eyes sharp, his hand steady on the revolver. Ayoka followed close, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. By the time the men reached the room upstairs, the window was swinging open and the beds were empty. Boone and Ayoka were already gone, moving east through the brush, the lights of Silver Creek shrinking behind them like a dying fire. They rode through the night, pushing east until the glow of Silver Creek faded completely behind them. The land flattened into open scrub, the air cool and dry. The moon hung low, casting their shadows long across the ground. Boone's horse breathed heavy beneath him, hooves muffled by sand. Ayoka rode double, arms tied around his waist, silent except for her steady breath against his back. Neither spoke for hours. The silence between them was not comfort now. It was concentration, the kind born from knowing someone was behind you and closing in. By dawn, they reached the ridge overlooking a valley scattered with dead mesquite and half-buried fence posts. Boone stopped the horse and scanned the trail behind. Nothing yet, but he could feel it, the slow crawl of pursuit. He'd lived too long not to sense danger before it showed itself. "We'll rest a moment," he said quietly. Ayoka slid down, her legs stiff. Her face was pale from lack of sleep, eyes dark beneath the edges of her shawl. Boone handed her the canteen, then crouched to check the tracks they'd left in the dust. He didn't like what he saw. 3 horses. Fresh. They're half a day behind. She looked toward the horizon. "They won't stop." "No," Boone said. "But neither will we." They rode again until midday, when the sun turned cruel and the air shimmered like glass. By then, they had reached an abandoned way station, a small cabin with a rusted water pump and a fallen telegraph pole beside it. Boone dismounted, checked the pump, and found a trickle of water. "We stay here till sundown," he said. "Travel by night from now on." Inside, the cabin was quiet except for the wind rattling through broken boards. Dust covered the floor, and a single iron bed stood in the corner. Boone swept the space with his rifle ready before giving the signal to enter. Ayoka moved to the window and pulled a torn curtain aside. From there, the valley stretched wide and silent. She turned to him. "What happens if they catch us?" Boone set his rifle down, his expression unreadable. "Then we make sure they don't." She didn't ask again. As the sun dropped, Boone went out to gather brush for a small fire, leaving her alone inside. She sat by the window, turning one of her mother's beads in her fingers, remembering her exile, how her uncle's men had dragged her through camp, how her own kin had turned away. She had run with only what she could carry. The men following now might not be from her tribe, but she knew their kind. Men who hunted what they thought belonged to them. When Boone returned, she saw the exhaustion in his face for the first time. The wound in his shoulder had reopened from the long ride, blood soaking through the bandage. She crossed the room, her voice firm but quiet. "Sit down." He didn't argue. She cleaned the wound again, this time more carefully. His jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "You should have left me," she said suddenly. "Back at Silver Creek." Boone looked at her, his eyes steady. "You think I could have? I brought this trouble," she whispered. "If you die because of me." He cut her off, his tone low but certain. "You didn't bring it. This world did. It always does." She stared at him, unsure how to respond. Boone's calm wasn't cold. It was conviction, the kind built on too many years of surviving alone. For the first time, she saw the depth of it. He wasn't fearless. He was simply done with running from fear. When night came, Boone doused the fire, and they waited in the dark. Hours passed before the sound reached them, a faint, rhythmic pounding from the west. "Horses." Boone motioned for silence. "Stay low," he whispered. "If they pass, we move north. If not," the rest didn't need saying. The riders appeared near the ridge, their silhouettes outlined against the moonlight. Boone counted 3. They reined up about 50 yards from the cabin, voices muffled by the wind. One carried a rifle across his lap. Another led a second horse with empty saddlebags. Ayoka's hand closed around Boone's sleeve. He whispered, "Stay down." When the first man dismounted and started toward the cabin, Boone shifted position, resting the rifle's barrel on the windowsill. He waited, slow, patient, until the man came close enough for his boots to crunch on the gravel. Then he fired once. The crack split the air, echoing off the rocks. The man dropped instantly. The other 2 scattered, one firing wild into the dark, the other spurring his horse forward. Boone's second shot hit the saddle horn, shattering it, sending the horse rearing. The surviving rider shouted something Boone couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears, then bolted back into the valley. The one who fired was hit in the shoulder, but managed to crawl behind a rock outcropping. Boone held his aim, waiting for a clean shot, but the man stayed hidden. Then the voice came, hoarse and furious. "You're Boone Ward, ain't you? The one they say shot a marshal in Abilene." Boone didn't flinch. "You heard wrong." The man laughed bitterly. "No, I heard right. You're wanted same as she is. Makes no difference which one of you I bring in." Ayoka froze. She turned toward Boone, disbelief in her eyes. "Is it true?" Boone didn't look at her. "I didn't kill that man," he said evenly. But the badge didn't care. I walked away before they could decide otherwise. The outlaw shouted again, but Boone ignored him, scanning the shadows. Then, from behind the cabin, a soft click, another gun being cocked. Boone spun fast, but not fast enough. A fourth man stepped out of the dark, barrel aimed straight at Ayoka. "Drop it, War," the man said, "or she dies first." Boone froze. The standoff stretched thin, seconds crawling slow. Ayoka's breath trembled, her eyes steady on Boone. He could see her lips move slightly, whispering something he couldn't hear. Then she moved, sudden, sharp, grabbing the rifle barrel and twisting hard. The gun fired, flash lighting the room. Boone reacted instantly, one clean shot. The man dropped, his weapon clattering to the floor. Smoke filled the air, thick and bitter. Boone crossed the room in 2 strides, caught Ayoka by the shoulders. "You all right?" She nodded, shaken but alive. "You still breathing?" he said. Outside, the last rider was gone. The valley was quiet again, except for the crackle of fire from the fallen gunpowder. Boone walked out, checked the ground. No more movement. He came back inside and sat heavily against the wall, breathing deep. Ayoka knelt beside him, wiping blood from his cheek where a splinter had grazed him. Their eyes met, and for the first time, neither looked away. "What now?" she asked softly. Boone glanced toward the doorway, where dawn's first light was beginning to show. "Now we stop running. We make our stand where no one's chasing shadows." "And where is that?" He looked at her with a faint, tired smile. "Wherever we build it." They spent the rest of the morning burying the bodies outside the cabin. Boone didn't speak as he worked. Ayoka helped quietly, her movements slow but steady. When it was done, they stood side by side, watching the sun climb higher. Neither of them had much left, not in supplies, not in strength, but they had what mattered, each other alive, unbroken. As Boone saddled the horse, he said, "We head south. Find land with water. We start again." Ayoka looked at him, eyes steady, voice calm. "Then I'll ride with you." He gave a short nod. "All right." They mounted and turned toward the horizon, the burned valley behind them fading into heat and dust. Ahead, the sky stretched clear and wide, the first clean piece of land they could finally call their own. They rode south until the land changed. The soil turned dark, and the horizon spread open into low hills lined with dry grass and clusters of mesquite trees. It was quiet country, far from any road or town, a place forgotten by both law and war. Boone slowed the horse when they reached a shallow creek that wound between cottonwoods. The water was clean, clear enough to see fish darting between stones. He dismounted, took a long look around, and said, "Here, this'll do." Ayoka slid off the horse and followed him to the edge of the water. The air was still, carrying only the faint sound of wind moving through branches. "You've been here before," she said. He shook his head. "No, but it looks like somewhere a man could stop without being found." That was the first time either of them had said it out loud. Stop. Until then, everything had been movement, from one hiding place to the next, from one uncertain tomorrow to another. Now, for the first time, they had reached a place that didn't feel temporary. Boone unpacked their gear, laying it out in neat rows. Rifle, bedrolls, tin cups, a small sack of coffee. Ayoka knelt beside him, already clearing a patch of ground near the creek to build a fire. They worked in rhythm, no words needed. By sundown, a small blaze crackled between them, the smoke rising in a straight line into the cooling sky. That night, they didn't speak of the men they buried. They didn't speak of what would come next. They simply sat side by side, listening to the crickets and the soft flow of the creek. For Boone, silence had always meant distance. Now it meant peace. For Ayoka, silence had once meant exile. Now it meant safety. At dawn, Boone began to build. He cut posts from the cottonwoods and hauled flat stones from the creek bed. His movements were slow but steady, each strike deliberate. Ayoka joined him, clearing brush, gathering reeds for the roof, and fashioning a crude broom from tied branches. When he saw her carrying twice her weight, he wanted to tell her to rest, but he knew better. She needed to work. So did he. By the third day, they had walls, rough, uneven, but standing. Boone repaired the gaps with mud, and Ayoka lined the inside with woven mats she made from dried grass. When he watched her hands move, her focus unbroken, something inside him shifted. He wasn't a man who prayed, but he understood gratitude in moments like that. Quiet, wordless, honest. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and shared what little food they had left. Boone hunted small game near the hills. Ayoka gathered herbs and roots she recognized from her homeland. Once, she caught him studying her as she prepared the stew. "You never asked what I'll do if they come again," she said. "I won't need to," he replied. "You already showed me." That made her smile. It was the first time she'd smiled without hesitation. Weeks passed. The cabin took shape. They found an abandoned plow half buried near an old trail and repaired it with wire and nails. Boone planted corn and beans in narrow rows along the creek bed. Ayoka set traps for fish and mended clothes from tan hide. At night, they talked more. Boone told her about the war, how he'd buried friends in Kansas, how one mistake with a trigger turned him into a fugitive. She listened without judgment. When he finished, she said only, "You left because you still had a choice." That's not a crime. When she spoke of her tribe, her words were measured but steady. She told him about her mother's death, about the elder's decision that she'd brought shame for refusing marriage. They called it exile, she said, but it was a sentence. The desert was meant to finish what they started. She looked into the fire as she spoke, eyes glinting in the orange light. It didn't. Boone looked at her then, really saw her, not as someone he'd rescued, but as someone who had saved herself long before he arrived. "You're tougher than any man I've met," he said quietly. "Tough isn't the same as safe," she answered. "But I'll take it." By the time the first storm of spring rolled across the plains, their home stood solid. The roof held firm against the rain, and the fire burned clean. They had extra wood stacked under cover, enough food to last weeks, and 2 horses now, the second found wandering near the hills. Boone built a small corral, and Ayoka painted symbols on the posts, marks from her people meant to protect what was built by hand. One evening, as they watched the sky turn gold over the hills, Boone turned to her. "We should bring a pastor out here," he said quietly. "If you want." Ayoka looked at him for a long moment. "Do you think we need someone else's words to make this real?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "No, I guess we don't." She reached out and placed her hand over his. "Then our promise is enough." The days after that moved slower, filled with work and quiet contentment. Boone carved a small wooden horse and gave it to her one evening, saying nothing as he placed it in her palm. She threaded a turquoise bead through its neck and tied it with a leather cord. It hung by the door from then on, turning gently in the breeze each time they came or went. By midsummer, the crops began to sprout. The land, once barren, carried color again. They had no visitors, no lawmen, no bounty hunters, just wind, sky, and the steady hum of life returning. Boone no longer looked over his shoulder when the sun set. Ayoka no longer hid her face when strangers passed far off the ridge. The fear that once drove them had thinned, replaced by something simpler, belonging. One night, under the clean light of the moon, they sat outside the cabin. The air was warm, the creek running slow beside them. Boone leaned back against the steps, eyes half closed. "Feels strange," he murmured, "to have nothing chasing us." Ayoka smiled softly. "Maybe that's what freedom feels like." He turned to her, his expression calm, almost peaceful. "If it is, then we'll keep it." The fire crackled between them, steady and bright. For the first time, neither of them was waiting for danger or for the past to catch up. They had built something that was theirs, earned, fragile but real. By late summer, the hills had turned dry again. The grass cracked underfoot, and every breeze carried dust instead of cool air. Boone and Ayoka had grown used to the quiet rhythm of their days, working the rows at dawn, mending tools in the shade by noon, and sitting by the creek when the heat fell away. The corn stood tall, the beans ready to harvest, and the cabin, once a fragile shelter, now looked like it had been part of the land forever. Boone had built a porch rail, and Ayoka had planted sunflowers along the edge, their bright heads bowing in the sun. That piece ended the morning. Boone smelled smoke on the wind. He was fixing the corral gate when he caught it, faint at first, then heavier the kind that meant brush fire, not campfire. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing toward the western ridge. The horizon wavered with a thin gray haze. Ayoka stepped out of the cabin, wiping her hands on her skirt. "What is it?" "Fire," Boone said. "And it's coming fast." She looked toward the west, seeing it too, the pale smoke line thickening as the wind shifted. "What do we do?" Boone didn't hesitate. "We cut a line." He grabbed a shovel from the wall, slung a bucket over his arm, and motioned for her to follow. Together they moved toward the fields, where the corn rustled under the rising wind. They worked without pause. Boone dug into the earth, cutting a narrow trench to bare soil, his muscles tight from old wounds but steady. Ayoka hauled water from the creek, soaking the ground behind him, her hair plastered to her face with sweat. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of distant crackling. The fire wasn't visible yet, but the air was turning hot and metallic, thick with ash. Boone's voice stayed calm. "We'll hold the line here. If it jumps the ridge, we light our own fire break." Ayoka didn't answer. She just worked harder. Her arms burned, her throat raw from smoke. Boone glanced at her once, meaning to tell her to rest, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. She wouldn't quit before he did. By midday, the fire reached the ridge. It came with a low roar, a wall of orange and black that rolled like a living thing. Boone lit small counterfires along the trench, the flames swallowing dry grass before the main blaze could reach it. The smoke thickened, choking and heavy. Ash fell like gray snow. "Get back," Boone shouted, dragging Ayoka behind the ditch as a gust sent sparks flying. They hit the dirt together, covering their faces. The air pulsed with heat, so fierce it felt alive. For a few seconds, all they could hear was the hiss and crack of fire devouring the ridge. Then, just as fast, the wind shifted. Boone looked up, coughing, eyes watering. The counterfire had held. The flames on both sides had met and died, leaving only blackened earth and the smell of burnt cedar. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "It's over," he said. Ayoka sat up slowly, covered in ash, her chest rising and falling fast. She looked at him through the smoke. "We did it." He nodded. "We did." They sat there for a long while, side by side in the scorched earth, neither speaking. When they finally rose, the sun was low, and the land lay quiet again, blackened but still standing. The cabin was untouched. The fields were singed at the edges but alive. That night, they washed in the creek, the water turning gray with soot. Boone's hands were raw, his shirt burned at the sleeve. Ayoka leaned beside him, scrubbing her arms in silence. When the water cleared, she looked at him. "You think it's really over?" Boone met her eyes. "Yeah, this time it is." In the weeks that followed, the fire scar began to fade. Green shoots pushed through the black soil. The air smelled clean again. Boone repaired the corral and patched the fence, while Ayoka replanted what was lost. Neighbors from nearby homesteads came to help. Quiet folk who'd heard of the fire and rode out with seed, tools, and fresh bread. For the first time, Boone and Ayoka weren't just two survivors. They were part of something larger, even if they never asked for it. One morning, an older rancher rode up, bringing a bag of seed and a wordless nod of respect. "Heard what you two did," he said. "Most would have run. You stayed." Boone gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. Had nowhere else to go. The man tipped his hat and rode off. Boone watched him disappear down the trail, the faintest trace of pride flickering in his chest. Later that evening, Boone and Ayoka sat on the porch steps with coffee in hand, watching the sunset paint the sky gold and crimson. The air was calm, the sound of the creek steady. Boone's shoulder ached when he moved, but he didn't mind. Pain, he'd learned, meant you'd live through something worth remembering. Ayoka reached out, resting her hand over his. Her skin was still rough from work, warm from the fading light. "You were right," she said softly. "This land is good." Boone looked at her, the corners of his mouth tightening in what passed for a smile. "It's home now." They sat together in silence, watching as the last light faded behind the cottonwoods. There was no fear, no need to run, no shadow of the past reaching for them anymore. What began with a lie by a creek had turned into something neither of them could have imagined. Two broken lives rebuilt from the same fire that once tried to destroy them. When the stars came out, Boone leaned back against the post, his voice low. You ever think about going back? To your people? Ayoka shook her head. No, I have my people now. He didn't answer, but his hand stayed on hers until the night turned cold. By morning, the world smelled of rain again. The fields glistened under dew, the creek ran clear, and the small cabin stood firm under the brightening sky. Boone walked out to the porch, his rifle resting by the door, and watched the land stretch wide and still. Ayoka stepped beside him, her hair loose in the breeze. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. The journey was done. They had stayed, and staying had become the truest kind of love either of them had ever known.